Hey, Drew here to talk about the fourth episode of the CBS All Access miniseries, The Stand, based on the novel by Stephen King, of course. And this episode, The House of the Dead, I would have to say was really Harold's episode more than any other character. And if there's one actor on this show that I really feel is conveying their character well, I think that it would have to be Owen Teague as Harold. And there are moments in this episode where you have your skin crawling because of this character. I think that there is definitely a creepy vibe given off by Owen Teague, but I have to say that there are moments where I did feel a degree of sympathy for this character. And I do think it is one of the strengths of this show that it doesn't make its villains people that we can't sympathize with. It shows them as human beings with human flaws and desires. And in this episode, there are things that happen to Harold that I would say are super relatable. Having your affections for someone not be reciprocated as he declares his love for Franny. Whether or not he actually loves her is kind of beside the point. I'm not sure he knows what it means to love someone truly, but to have himself be rejected so forcefully. And I think it's something that, he probably felt he was entitled to, although obviously he wasn't, but he might have felt entitled given that he saved her life and he protected her and he's taken her all this way and he's been her companion. And now to have her say that she could never love him, I feel like she could have been a little bit more gentle, but we have to see this motivated for Harold. And to see him, so helpless and unable to do anything in the face of this attacker. Now, that's a scene that to me, it was a lot more interesting in the novel, not to go into a really blow by blow comparison, but in the show, I felt that having this solitary individual attack them and, be about to hold the women captive, I felt like it just seemed a little bit cartoonish. And the guy, to be truthful, just didn't seem that threatening because they never really let him do anything that villainous. He was only there to basically beat up Harold. I did think the moment where the gun went off and killed the woman who we had just met, I think that, kind of captured the chaos of the situation a little bit and was kind of a shocking moment. But other than that, I felt like everything seemed a little bit too orchestrated and, it didn't feel like something happening in real time so much. But in this scene, you see Harold, who has tried to cast himself as this protector of Franny, just being completely helpless and frightened and scared, and to ultimately have Stu swoop in, even though Stu wasn't the one who killed this attacker. To see Stu swoop in and kind of save the day or get credit for having saved the day, you could see how that would just drive Harold crazy with jealousy and resentment. And I'm not saying he's justified. I'm just saying it's understandable why he would feel the way that he feels. Now, obviously, what he does with that is completely inexcusable and, takes him down a very, very dark route. And for those of you who haven't read the book, you can probably guess where this is going, but he hasn't gone there yet, so I'm going to try to avoid spoilers for that. But I definitely thought that his arc this episode, ending with him working together with Nadine and getting those explosives, and ultimately, the payoff for this time that he's spent developing this relationship with Ted, having him be the one to kill Ted in this fashion, fully signaling, kind of that he has turned away from the possibility of his better self and is fully embracing his destructive and vengeful side. It's really sad, and, I think it's a good character arc for this character. Obviously, this is not entirely the way Stephen King worked it out in the book, but, it is a very, very strong character as Stephen King interpreted him. And I always find the gray characters in these types of stories the most fascinating. I think that, Harold is more interesting than your Stews, for instance. This episode, we also got to see a little bit more of Nick and his relationship with Tom Cullen, played by Brad William Henke, play out. And I have to say, I really, really like the way that they're portraying Tom Cullen. I think that this character is wonderful, and I really am enjoying his dynamic with Nick. I think that they're one of the more interesting pairings in the show. I would love to spend more time with them. But symptomatic of the problems with this show, I felt like the scene overall where they brought in Julie Lowry just briefly, it just didn't work because it's such a cursory. They only really developed the scene at such a cursory level that it just didn't really go anywhere. It could have just basically been excised and it wouldn't have really mattered. I get that they want to include her, but she was a very memorable character in the book. But I think if you hadn't read the book, you'd just kind of be like, what's the deal here? Because there just wasn't anything that interesting that happened during this interaction. I thought it was funny because when they saw the sign, I thought that it was Glenn on the sign because, obviously Greg Kinnear has been modeling his performance after Stephen King. And then it occurred to me, oh wait, that's actually Stephen King, not Glenn. So I think that Greg Kinnear has clearly been doing a pretty good job, or the costuming department has, of channeling Stephen King, because I, for a moment, just thought it was Glenn. And this episode, Glenn had a lot of interesting moments as well. I particularly enjoyed his discussion with Harold, where, he basically argued that, faith in things that we don't know, they're worth investigating, even though we don't know, it basically seems like magic to us, but like the first person to look into a microscope, we're going to discover it was all scientific after all, which I would basically put this conversation in the category of fine-sounding nonsense. I kind of get the idea of it, and this is not to ridicule anyone's beliefs, but I think that some ideas obviously have a better initial plausibility than others, and if we had to hunt down every idea, whether or not it could be true, no matter how implausible, then that just wouldn't work out. I mean, I think we have to start with the most plausible things. But, obviously this story has a lot to say about faith and how it motivates people, which brings me to Mother Abigail, who I feel has really, really not been developed adequately in this show, and the fleeting scenes we get with her are just not enough. I think that because all the characters are doing what she wants, there's a major component of their motivation missing in the fact that we hardly have gotten to see her and to know what she's telling them to do and why. I get to a certain extent the character is a symbolic character. She's a representation of a higher power. But to me, I feel like you just kind of have to have some more scenes with her. I think that the way that they've done this, they should have by now given us some of the scenes where she's meeting the characters and what she's telling them and why they're listening to her, why they're not, going their own ways, doing their own things. Why she holds so much power over this community has not really been established. And I think that that's an important missing piece because all the characters are very heavily motivated by it. And it just feels like we're missing information that we need to understand what we're seeing these characters do. The scene where they say, well, Mother Abigail has said not to do this and we're going against her wishes. Like, that would have held more power if we understood better why Mother Abigail's word holds so much sway with them. To a lesser extent, Randall Flagg, who doesn't appear this episode, I feel like he needs to be more fleshed out as well. But that's, something that I think can come later. And it's okay that he's a peripheral presence at this point. I feel like Mother Abigail not being better portrayed at this point is a serious flaw that should have been rectified. I think that it's interesting, we see civilization starting to be rebuilt. I think it's a good thing that they remembered to get the power grids, to check to make sure that they didn't have all this electric stuff on so that it would wipe out the power grids this time. I do feel that there were some oddities this episode. I don't understand why Stu is the one that spoke to everyone. They really did not make a good case. I think they kind of understood this because they brought up his accent as a reason that people would listen to him, because I think they realize it's kind of flimsy. Like, why does everybody think this character is the man? I get it. It's Stephen King's everyman, reliable male that he, kind of specializes in. But in the context of this show, they talk about his charisma, and I think Glenn's pretty charismatic. I think Larry's pretty charismatic. I think that, when you have Larry, played by Jovan Adepo, immediately before Stu takes the stage, kind of speaking to people and being, I would argue, more charismatic than Stu. It just kind of seems odd that they're like, no, you're the one who has to talk to people. But I did appreciate the scene, between him and Glenn, where Glenn, was kind of advising him, how to lie to people without actually lying them, how to play politics. And, you're seeing in this episode, I think one of the things that people find really interesting about this story is you're seeing why civilizations are the way they are, because you're seeing them have to build from the ground up. You're seeing them, having the reasons to get law enforcement, the reasons that they have to have politicians, essentially, which is what Stu is essentially becoming, and all these other aspects that a society needs, and seeing it, come in to being. It's pretty interesting, seeing the forces of order come into place. So overall, this was a decent episode. I think that one thing about this show that I will say is not a weakness is that I never feel like an episode is just a filler episode. There's never an episode where I'm like, man, nothing happened this episode. Because they have so much to get through. If anything, the show's problem is that too much is happening, so they kind of give short shrift to everything. Nothing gets established as well as it should. But I never get bored because there is always something pretty interesting happening. So those are just my thoughts. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows such as Servant, potentially WandaVision, let me know if you want to see me review that. I'm kind of trying to decide whether I'm going to do it because I have so many things to review coming up. And also American Gods this weekend, the first episode of season 3 coming out. If you're interested in seeing any of those reviews, please consider subscribing. If you liked anything I said, give me a like. And as always, thanks for watching.